Uncovering History, the Founding Fathers and Those in Their Shadows, Part 15, The Battle of Germantown and the Return of the Marquis de Lafayette. Despite being thoroughly beaten at Brandywine, Washington and his forces maintained a relatively positive outlook. Even after defeat, Washington's desire was nothing more than to keep Howe and the British from reaching Philadelphia and overtaking the American capital by any means necessary. However, Washington did not possess the capability to meet the entire British army head-on, so he decided to fight small skirmishes by picking off British soldiers here and there, thus engaging in guerrilla warfare. But the British were likewise capable of applying similar tactics. And in late September, around 1 o'clock in the morning, General James Gray of the British Army surprised Continental Army General Anthony Wayne's force while they were sleeping. During this quick and decisive assault, the British didn't fire a single shot as they quietly entered the American camp, using nothing more than their bayonets to capture and kill almost the entire American force. Many of the men were unable to even get out of their blankets before they were mercilessly stabbed to death by the British bayonet. Only a few of the men managed to escape the carnage by fleeing into the darkness of the woods, while the rest were either killed or taken prisoner. That evening, some 300 American soldiers perished at the hands of the British. The battle, or massacre, came to be known as the Paoli Massacre because of its proximity to the Paoli Tavern. When news of the massacre reached the ears of Washington, he was visibly shaken and alarmed, fearing he would again be outflanked by Howe and the British. Soon thereafter, Howe did just that, by luring Washington and his army some 10 miles up the Schuylkill River to Fatland Ford, while Howe and his men easily slipped into Philadelphia and overtook the city. Had the city of Philadelphia been taken months earlier, it may have ended the war, or at least destroyed American morale. But a surprise American victory of the British General John Burgoyne to the north, at the hands of American General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, turned the momentum of the war back into the rebels' favor by opening up the northern part of the colonies to the south. This American victory posed a significant threat to Howe, as he was just getting comfortable in Philadelphia. Holding and securing Philadelphia quickly proved to be a formidable task for Howe, as the American forces cut off all the main supply routes by both land and water, making it difficult for Howe and the British to remain in Philadelphia. In order to stave off the various American assaults, Howe began to spread his army out into smaller forces in an attempt to neutralize the American antagonists. This prompted Washington to go back on the offensive and strike the British. And by early October, an opportunity presented itself that Washington could not and would not pass up. General Howe had concentrated some 9,000 of his men in and around Germantown, about 10 miles from Philadelphia. So Washington quickly adopted an elaborate and complicated attack plan. The attack plan on the British comprised of 4 columns of troops spread out over several miles that would simultaneously converge on the British and squeeze them like a clamp. If executed correctly, the plan would ensure an American victory. But coming off a recent and severely bad defeat at Brandywine, some of the soldiers were hesitant and timid to attack such a large British force. However, Washington possessed an uncanny way of rallying his men, telling them that while the Northern Army had scored a great victory, the Southern Army would not be outdone by them. Washington said, "Covet, my countrymen and fellow soldiers, covet a share of the glory due to heroic deeds. Let it never be said that in a day of action you turned your backs on the foe. Let the enemy no longer triumph. Washington also sent a stark reminder of what the British thought of them when he said, "The enemy brand you with ignominious epithets. Will you patiently endure that reproach? Will you suffer the wounds of your country to go unavenged? Will you resign your parents, wives, children, and friends to be the wretched vassals of a proud, insulting foe, and your own necks to the halter?" Of course, Washington was delivering a stark reminder to his men that they were branded as traitors who would, if they lost the war, pay the ultimate price of death for their treason, and their families would likewise suffer a similar fate. On October 3rd, at dusk, the Continental Army split into several different regiments, marching all night towards Germantown. William Smallwood's Maryland Regiment was on the extreme right flank, and were almost immediately confused by the orders, and would never engage the British. The main forces that would engage the British were General Sterling, Sullivan, Stevens, Conway, and Wayne, with Greene in the back. Having all split up, they were to be in position by 4 o'clock in the morning and ready to attack. As dawn was quickly approaching, there was an extremely dense fog that rolled in, further complicating matters for the American forces as they were poised to attack simultaneously, but were now visually impaired. This posed a significant problem for the American forces because everything about the attack hinged on timing. By 5 a.m., the initial firing of the guns from the Americans commenced. It didn't seem to immediately alarm the British regiment led under Colonel Thomas Musgrave, as they assumed the shots were being fired from a scouting party. However, as the Americans began to rain fire onto the British and press the action, the British quickly realized this was a full frontal attack, prompting them to fall back to a large stone house, barricading themselves inside of it. When the first unit of American forces passed by the now barricaded home, they were eager to attack, seeking revenge for the Paoli Massacre. However, as Washington and more men arrived, it was determined they should vacate the area and pursue the main British force. But Henry Knox argued to Washington, insisting that it would be advantageous to storm the stone house to protect their rear from a possible later British assault. Washington obliged, and Colonel Maxwell's men were sent in to attack the heavily armed home. It was later documented that the British commander in the home informed his men that the Americans were not going to take any prisoners, as they were seeking revenge for the Paoli Massacre, so this was deemed a no-surrender situation. As the American soldiers charged the home, that moment proved to be the start of a cascade of mistakes, as they suffered heavy casualties while trying to dislodge the British. Not far up the road, Washington and his men heard the echo of significant gunfire. Growing weary and somewhat confused by all the action, while the Americans were still winning the battle, things quickly began to unravel as timing miscues of the regiments proved to be fatal. On the map, the attack plan appeared to be flawless, but after some 45 minutes time elapsed, General Greene's men reached the foggy battlefield, and because of General Wayne's rapid progress, General Stevens' men began to engage the flank and fire on their own men instead of the British. As the confusion set in, one eyewitness said that because of the dense fog and smoke from the guns, it was as black as night, and their leader, General Stevens, was thoroughly drunk. It was a devastating assault as Stevens' men opened fire on Wayne's regiment, and the British, in turn, opened fire on Wayne's regiment from the opposite end. Now, the previously startled and retreating British commanded the momentum. As Greene's regiment moved in towards the enemy, believing they had their flanks covered by Stevens' and Wayne's regiments, they were now having to face the British alone as the other two American regiments were retreating to safety. Quickly realizing they were vastly outnumbered, Greene ordered a retreat while the British pursued them for some 10 miles. The Battle of Germantown would have been an easy victory for the Americans had General Stevens and his men not made the grievous error of friendly fire. Because of his incompetence, Washington removed Stevens from his position and ordered it to the Marquis de Lafayette. By now, Washington and his badly beaten Continental Army needed to regroup, making their winter quarters at Valley Forge. Suffering immensely there from starvation, cold weather, and disease, Washington himself was dealt another devastating blow. Behind closed doors, there were enemies within his army plotting against him over what they determined to be his mishandling of the war. This was further fueled by the fact that the army had just faced multiple defeats, prompting these men to adopt a plan to rid Washington as commander-in-chief. This plot came to be known as the Conway Cabal. Washington learned of the Cabal, or plot to replace him, through a letter written by Thomas Conway to Horatio Gates criticizing his leadership and tactics. Gates, who desired power and was recently recognized as a hero in the Battle of Saratoga, desperately wanted the position. Even some in Congress and former Congressman Benjamin Rush wanted Washington replaced, while others were just critical of his decision-making. Though the Cabal seemed possible, it was quickly extinguished as no one was more qualified to lead the army than Washington. However, that didn't stop Thomas Conway from spreading lies about General Washington, which led to a challenge on the dueling grounds from General John Cadwalader. In the duel, Cadwalader vowed to silence the Conway rascal, and he did. As the men took aim and readied their firearms to shoot, Cadwalader fired a round that went straight through the mouth of Conway, exiting out the back of his head. That winter of 1777 at Valley Forge was truly a test for Washington, and by spring, he desperately needed a well-trained army. During those cold winter months at Valley Forge, the men would officially become professional soldiers under the guide of Baron von Steuben, who by spring had trained them to fight and present themselves like a respectable army. An injured but recovering Lafayette was also busy during this time, writing a multitude of letters to his wife, family, and the King of France, advocating him to declare war against the British. And on December 4th, 1777, after news of the American victory at Saratoga reached France, the French officially recognized the United States of America as a sovereign nation and joined the war to help defeat the British. With France's declaring war on Great Britain, it changed the trajectory of the war as it evolved from what was viewed as an insurrection against the mother country to an all-out war. And as spring arrived, there was a resurgence at Valley Forge when French soldiers began arriving to assist the Americans. It was time to take back Philadelphia. With Lafayette now mostly recovered, Washington sent him and his men on a mission to watch British movements and harass them but not engage them in an all-out battle. Washington also warned the young lad not to set up any camps, but to keep actively moving. During this time, the young boy would be stretched beyond his military experience. Not heeding General Washington's advice, Lafayette immediately set up camp on Barren Hill the very first night of his mission. The hill was situated between Valley Forge and Philadelphia and seemed like a good base of camp, offering great panoramic views along with a steep cliff on one side. When General Howe learned of the boy's whereabouts, he sent 8,000 soldiers to trap him. Howe desperately wanted to capture the boy because of the significant role Lafayette played in luring France into war against Britain. And by the next morning, Lafayette and his men were nearly encircled by 8,000 British soldiers with seemingly no path of escape. Being outnumbered 8-1, but the British not knowing that, Lafayette hatched a genius plan. In the densely wooded areas, Lafayette dispatched small groups of men to open fire, with another group behind them firing immediately after, giving the impression that there were more men than the British had anticipated. Keeping the British occupied, Lafayette then began an organized retreat down the back side of the cliff to safety, while his men slowly fell back as well. It was absolutely genius, as the British began to quickly converge on what they thought was the enemy. They were instead firing and killing their own men. It wasn't until the smoke from the musket fire began to settle that the British realized their colossal error. By then, Lafayette and his men were far from the reach of the British and escaped unscathed. Washington had a newfound respect for the young man, as Lafayette was able to think creatively, not panic, and keep his composure when the odds were stacked against him. The Marquis de Lafayette's maneuver was perhaps one of the most brilliant moves in the Revolution. With sights now set on getting the capital city of Philadelphia back, Washington was ready for another collision with Howe and the British. While Washington would engage the British, he would not face Howe again, as Howe relinquished his position as commanding general of the British Army to Sir Henry Clinton.